Join us by the fireside for our evening tales of true life's strange experiences with things that lie beyond the veil of the known and into the misty depths of the mysterious and unknown.
The strange phenomena. I'm from Finland, and that's also where these things I'm about to describe to you happened. This happened a few years ago, before smartphones, GPS, and so on. It was the end of the summer, and both myself and two friends were going on a camping trip way up in the north in Lapland. The mosquito season was actually over by now, and the weather was cooling down, and fall was actually coming. The three of us had packed our food and gear for about 10 days' trek. The car we arrived in had been left at the parking lot of a visitor center, and this happened within the area of the Urho Kekkonen National Park. It's a 985 square mile stretch of wilderness near the Russian border. The terrain there varies greatly, and it can be treeless in some places and then semi-mountainous, and then also has dense forests of spruce and pine and dwarf birch. There are lots of swamps, and sometimes you see reindeer, and you might hear wolves at a distance. You can run into a bear or a wolverine in any place there, but of course normally they just avoid people. So we mostly camped in a tent, but some nights we used shelters and just simple huts provided for the travelers free of charge. The trip had lasted 5 days, and we were at the furthest of any kind of civilization, and we were going to be on that particular outing alone, truly in the middle of nowhere. There really is nothing there except the forests or just the open land. There are no villages, there are no towns, no industry. This place is a national park, and there's just, no human habitation there. Seeing other hikers happen from time to time, you'd see some people in the distance maybe, but very rarely you'd actually come face to face with anyone. So in the middle of our trip, we were camped in this small clearing in the woodland, and the woodland extended around us for a considerable distance in all directions. It was already dark. We had eaten our evening meal, and all three of us were just sort of jammed into our only tent. It was a bit cramped, but we fit. We took turns carrying it during the hikes. We were just kind of exchanging some jokes and humor, like guys in their 20s do. We were about to go to sleep in our sleeping bags. When we quieted down, we began to hear it talking, and there was the sound of machinery. Now, given our location, this was profoundly weird and very unlikely. We camped in a tent because there were no huts nearby. Maybe there was another camp somewhere near us? We couldn't quite make out what was being said, but it was a human voice. There was no doubt about it. But nothing really could explain the sound of the heavy machinery in the background. It sounded like an excavator or a tank, something really big and powerful, and it really was not too far away from the sounds of it. So combined with the sound of talking, we thought maybe a construction yard, but at that time of night, in this unpopulated, protected nature reserve, it just seems so unlikely. We got out of our tent. It was cold and it was pitch black. The campfire had only a few glowing coals left in it. So we took out our flashlights. My two friends have always been a lot braver than me. The sound was clearly coming from the north, maybe half a kilometer away or so. We thought the construction might be going on behind a small hill some distance away. We could see no lights or anything. We still could not make out what was being said by the voice. The speaking-like voice was kind of monotonous, and it was impossible even to say what language was being used. Still, it sounded a lot like a person speaking, though. You may be aware of the sort of, weird phenomenon of hearing a human voice in static. Well, that's kind of what it was like. Maybe it was sort of like that. It's hard to explain. The machinery-like sound continued, not loud, but you could sort of make out the powerful engine at times accelerating, adding power, and then at other times it was idle. My two friends resolved to go and find out what was going on. We put our warm clothes back on, we put our boots on, and I sat next to the dying fire, adding some more wood to it. I would stay at camp while my two friends left to check out this mystery construction yard in the middle of nowhere in the Lapland woods. So I sat there by the fire. The guys took out their maps, took a compass, heading, and left, and I could hear them make their way through the forest. I could see the light from their flashlights. Then they were gone. The weird sounds continued unaltered. They were gone 15 minutes, then maybe 30. Then the better part of an hour. That was odd. Judging by the volume of the sound, they should have reached it by then, checked it out, and been back already. I kept adding more firewood and tried to make out what the person was talking about and was saying because I could still hear it, but it was too tinny and obscure. The guys had been away for over 2 hours now. I figured maybe they had stayed for coffee with the construction guys or something. I don't know. But then the sound stopped, just like that. It just ended. All at the same time. The engine sound and the voice just both quit and stopped. And it was very silent. I waited there nervously for another 30 minutes, and I was very, very worried now that something had happened, that maybe my friends were lost or something. Should I go and try to find them? I shouted their names several times, and I built a big fire so that, in case they were lost, they would see it. I was so scared. I didn't know what to do. And then suddenly, I saw the flashlights of my friends, and this was after about 2.5 hours. Apparently, they were returning in a hurry. The guys got back to camp out of breath, to my relief. They told me the following. They had followed the sound beyond the small ridge in the distance, like they said they were going to do. There was nothing there, and it seemed like they were not getting any closer to the source of the sounds either. They had to stop every now and then, be quiet, and listen to it to be able to walk towards it. They walked and stopped like this for some time, and then realized they were not getting any closer. The sounds did not change in volume at all. They decided to go just a bit further, several times, and when suddenly the sound would just stop, like someone pressed a button on the recording and it stopped. They realized they had been going on for a long time. They were in the middle of the dark woods, alone. They reversed the heading and started back at a brisk pace. And they actually ended up getting a little bit lost until eventually they saw my big fire from the top of a hill and they found their way back, thankfully. Now, the weird thing is that we seem to think the sound stopped at different times. They had been gone 2.5 hours in total. They said the sound stopped at around 1 hour, 15 minutes mark after they left. They then started to head back immediately, return trip taking a bit longer, even though they kept a good pace. They apparently wandered around a bit. For me, the sound stopped at the 2-hour mark, just 30 minutes before they returned. We did not sleep that night. Nothing more happened on that trip, and we never found out what the weird construction yard-like sound was all about. When we returned to the park's visitor center, some 5 days later, we did ask around, but no one knew anything of any ongoing construction taking place in the whole national park area. So this has been bugging me ever since, and I just don't have an explanation for what happened, but I do know that we distinctly heard it, and, it was just weird. I wonder if you were hearing some kind of logging, you know, thing that happened at some point there. Maybe it's you were in some kind of weird time loop and you actually got to hear some logging or, construction logging kind of thing that was going with all the machinery, at some point in history, in the past, whether recent or a long time ago, I don't know. But you almost kind of get that feeling, because what else would it be around there? But, it does sound like something supernatural. There's a possibility that maybe some sound might have carried over there because of weather conditions, where sound sometimes carries from far away, but that doesn't sound very likely. So, yeah, pretty weird experience. Very, very eerie. The shriveled thing. This happened about 10 years ago, and I was at a house party in a small, isolated town that more or less consisted of about 20 houses and a playground. There was myself, and we were with a few friends, and we were drinking at, quite a lot, considering our ages. But the atmosphere was quite subdued, and we ended up in one of those moods where we've got to do something. We were just kind of bored. After a, probably unwelcome search of the host's garage, we found this old game that some people might remember. It's called Sega Lock-On. This game was basically a commercial laser tag kit. Each set was a 2-player game, 2 guns and 2 visors. The hit sensor was encompassed in this headset visor with a red LED display showing your lives. We immediately knew we had to play it, though we quickly found that one of the headsets was broken. Working around the problem in a fairly cruel adolescent way, we resolved that the game would become a hunt rather than a fight. 2 people carried guns. I was in this role. A third person wore the headset and had to evade the other players with the rules established. The 3 of us made our way to the town's playground, which at this time of night was only lit by a road light. When we reached the park, my friend in the headset bolted off into a field, and he left me and another friend to buy the time while we gave him a head start. We kind of got carried away chatting about things, and by the time we got looking, our alcohol-shortened attention spans had moved on to something else. But we stumbled around the park anyway, not seeing much in the dark. On the edge of the park was a small wooden cabin, whose purpose can only be speculated as a sheltering place to watch football games from. It had a single entrance, and there was an opening in the front from which to, probably, view the rest of the park. As we walked by this, my friend and I heard this shuffling, scuffling kind of noise coming from inside the cabin. Our conversation stopped at that point because we started to feel a little bit scared, and we advanced onto this building. The inside of the cabin was actually partly lit by the street lamp, coming in through the door at a sort of odd angle that left the corners in the dark. In the dark of the back corner, we saw our friend, and we began firing our AA-operated handguns. We pressed forward as we fired, and we saw that our friend was crouched down for cover, reproducing the same sound as we'd previously heard, this sort of shuffling around stuff. We just fired and fired. We didn't think anything of it. We thought he was just playing around. But never once heard the ringing alarm sound that is generated by a successful hit, which was odd in itself because we should have hit him by now. At this point, the angle from which the streetlight entered the cabin seemed to shift, drifting towards the corner, illuminating it. And as it did so, the crouched figure that we'd been firing at just wilted. It just sort of closed up on itself like a ball, still maintaining the features of our friend, kind of like when you see a ball of newspaper burn. Its form shriveled, but you can still make out all the folds. By this point, both myself and my friend had stopped shooting. We didn't know what to do. We were just kind of frozen in this terror. And from my perspective, this was because I could now see that this person didn't have the red LED display of the headset. And the way this was looking was really, really messed up. This light continued to arc across the back of the cabin until it completely lit the corner. We watched whatever had been in there just melt away into the floor. My friend and I looked at each other, terrified for a moment, and we just both ran out of there like hell. We just ran as fast as we could. We got back to the street and we stopped, panting directly under the nearest street light. For a while, we couldn't say anything, completely unwilling to even explore the idea of what we just saw any further with words. But eventually, inevitably, we did talk about it. I was dying to hear that he'd seen a different thing than I did, but he had hoped the same. Ultimately, we had both seen the same thing. Now, we were drunk, definitely, but I've been drunk many times and I have never, ever seen anything like that before. And I've never seen a shadow in the corner that looked like a moving person, let alone that's the spitting image of my friend, just kind of melting like that. When we finally calmed down enough to get back to the party, we actually found out that the guy we were hunting, being a resident of this town, had known a shortcut out of the park and had been back at his house laughing at us before we'd finished counting up a head start. I don't know what the hell that thing was in there, but I know what I saw, and my friend saw it too at the same time. And I don't know, we've never ever wanted to go back there again, and I just completely avoid it altogether. Wow, that sounds like one of those really bizarre kind of completely unexplained paranormal things, you know. I mean, what was it, you know? It's not something that anyone could have faked. So it was like something was there and it was kind of just messing with you by pretending to be your friend and then terrifying you by kind of melting into the ground and all this kind of weird stuff. So, yeah, you know, good job you never went back.
The Crying Baby.
When we were younger, maybe about 13 or so, 3 friends and I were just kind of, you know, messing around after school as usual, riding our bikes and just doing what young teenagers do. We eventually rode past this old abandoned house that's kind of local for us, which has basically been there since we can remember. My friend's parents, who were here since the 70s, can remember that house being abandoned since then, too. Anyway, we rode past it as usual, and we decided to go a bit closer this time because we were always kind of curious, but we'd never really got that close to it. As we approached it, we saw, or rather thought we saw, that there was someone peeking through the curtains, but we weren't 100% certain. So as curious teenagers, we naturally went closer to try and investigate, and as we got closer, we did distinctly see that the curtains kind of drew back and the figure disappeared. We were confused, so we decided to approach the veranda, and that's when we heard a baby crying. The crying slowly seemed to be progressing into wailing, and eventually one friend had enough, and he decided to knock on the door to see if anyone was home. After about 5 minutes of knocking and continuing this wailing sound of the baby, the door did finally open to our surprise. It was this little lady. She looked to be maybe about 40 or so. My friend asked if everything was okay and if the baby was fine, and the lady just looked at him and said, "Go away." The friend continued to ask if she needed any help or if everything was okay, and she just simply continued to reply, "Go away." This just went on for about a minute till she closed the door on us, and this crying of the baby just became even louder. Now at this point, everything in my head was screaming, "Run, get out of there." But rather, my friend decided to knock again because he was concerned about the child being neglected. Eventually, after a few knocks, the door just kind of opened. It wasn't this scary creaking kind of thing, but rather it just unlocked. So we, as dumb teenagers, walked in to see if everything was okay, and partly due to curiosity. As all four of us walked in, the crying stopped, and we stood in this abandoned house, covered in dust, and everything was covered like it hadn't been inhabited in decades. We took a few steps forward, and this crying of the baby began again. By this point, we decided we needed to find the child, so myself and a friend went upstairs whilst the other two investigated downstairs. As we climbed the stairs, the crying got louder and louder, and we just continued to search each room slowly. Eventually, we reached the last room, and it was apparent that it was in there. So we opened the door to investigate. The first thing we both noticed was this room had nothing in it, except for a baby carriage in the far left corner near the window. The crying was from there. It was clear as day. We made our way to it, and we peeked over to find nothing, but the crying was still there. There was nothing inside it. My head started spinning, and I didn't know what to feel anymore. I was like this, almost like this panic was beginning to take over me. I called out for my friends downstairs, and they ran upstairs and saw, or rather didn't see, what we couldn't see. They filled us in to what they saw downstairs, which was the woman walking into the kitchen downstairs, in which they followed, and then she disappeared. We all knew that this whole situation was messed up, and we ran quickly to the front door. We got on our bikes, and we just looked back to see the door being closed slowly by someone and then locked. A few moments later, the curtains were pulled back by a woman holding a child, smiling, and we could see her very, very clearly. We rode hard and fast back out of their home, and we did not turn back. We didn't sleep much for a few days. A few years after the house got demolished, but people began seeing a woman holding a baby at the local park and bridge. That is, when you didn't see the kid who drowned in the sewers nearby. I hated that area and was so glad when we finally moved. And sometimes I drive past it at night, and it just has the worst feeling. It's always too quiet, and there's something so scary that it still scares me 11 years later. This sounds like a classic haunted house encounter, definitely. So it would have been interesting to know a little bit more about the mother and child and what happened to them there. Not really clear on that. The child drowned in the sewers nearby? I don't know. Anyway, very, very creepy. And also interesting that the mother and child was seen after the house was demolished. They were still seen in the area, though not, in that particular area of the house. That's more unusual. House sitting in a very old house. I had been house sitting for my aunt and uncle, and the experience I had that definitely raised some questions for me about the paranormal, and so on. Anyway, they were going out of town for a weekend, and they asked if I would keep an eye on the house and take care of their dogs while they were away. I was staying with my grandparents for the summer, as I usually did, and being 16 years old with a brand new driver's license, I just jumped at the chance for a few days of freedom with a house to myself and during my summer vacation. So I packed up my PlayStation, I rented some games and movies, stocked up on some snacks, and headed over to their house. The first night there was pretty uneventful, but I remember there was this distinct feeling of, kind of slightly uneasy being in that house. There's nothing out of the ordinary was going on. I just sort of attributed this feeling of uneasiness to being in the house alone for the first time, without my aunt and uncle there. So it was around 1 a.m. and I decided to go to bed, and I let the dogs out in the backyard to relieve themselves before bed. After they were done, I made sure everything was locked, and I, put on the deadbolt and the chain, locks on the doors, and so on. I woke up the next morning and I put some coffee on, and I got the dogs up to let them out. This uneasy feeling just remained though, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched or something, even though I knew there was no one else in the house. After breakfast, I decided I was going to just go for a bike ride and meet up with some friends. So I put the dogs in their crates and I just locked up the house and I headed out. I was gone for maybe 4 hours. It was until mid-afternoon when I decided to head back to the house. When I walked in, the dogs were freaking the hell out. Not your normal, happy to see you, let me out of the crate kind of thing, but more like there was this full-blown panic. They were shaking and they were foaming at the mouth and howling. Everything. They were just going crazy. These dogs are normally so calm and collected and are perfectly content to spend most of the day in their crates sleeping. They go in on their own for naps. So this was really, really out of the ordinary. So I opened the doors to their crates, not knowing what else to do. But neither of them wanted to come out. They were so scared. So this made me a little bit freaked out. And I decided that maybe I needed to check the house to make sure nothing had happened. All the windows were fine, everything was still locked, and the house was completely empty. Now, at this point, I should mention how the house is, kind of laid out. It's an old house from the late 1800s, and prior to my aunt and uncle owning it, it was divided up as a duplex. The upstairs was a separate apartment. They mentioned that an older woman had rented the upstairs while the previous owners lived downstairs. My aunt and uncle didn't rent the upstairs, but didn't really do anything to convert the house back into a single-family dwelling. My uncle used the upstairs apartment as his home office with several computers and a couple of modems, early 2000s dial-up. And most of the time, the door to the upstairs, in the enclosed porch off of the kitchen, just stayed closed and locked. So there really wasn't, any reason to go up there. I decided to be very cautious since the dogs were so freaked out that, I should check the whole house. So I unlocked the door to the upstairs and I went up to check. I was kind of nervous, I have to admit. I noticed that one of the computers was on. This was kind of odd, as my uncle had said in his note that he'd shut off everything upstairs and unplugged the surge protectors. Maybe he meant to do so, but got into a rush to get out of the door and forgot. Not a big deal. We were expecting storms later, so I shut the computer down and unplugged everything and went back downstairs, locking the door behind me. So by this time, the dogs had calmed down and had taken their usual spots on the couch where I joined them to play my PlayStation. After dinner, it was around 8 p.m. at this point, and the dogs and I were sitting around on the couch watching movies and just hanging out. Then all of a sudden, one of the dogs stands up on the couch with all of the fur on his back standing on end, and he begins growling towards the direction of the door to the stairs. He continued this for the next 5 to 10 minutes, and nothing I did or said would distract him from whatever he was sensing. He did eventually calm down, and he lay back beside me again. A few hours later, it was around 11 p.m., he started again, and the other dog joined in this time. That's when I began to hear creaking sounds coming from upstairs. It was like someone was stepping on a loose floorboard up there. It didn't sound like footsteps, just like someone rocking back and forth on the loose boards or something. So by now, I was really freaked out. But I decided to go and investigate. This time I noticed that the door to the upstairs was now unlocked. I had locked it when I went up there earlier. Oh hell, someone might be in the house. I took a few steps back into the kitchen and I grabbed a knife, like something out of a horror movie. I checked the porch door to the backyard, which would be where someone would come to get into the upstairs apartment if they were going to break in. It was still locked. Okay, weird. The creaking upstairs was still happening. I opened the door to the stairs and it immediately stopped, and that feeling of being watched was really intense. I turned the lights on and went upstairs. Nothing. By this point, I was really freaking out over nothing. It was probably just the house settling or something, I told myself. After all, it was an old house and these things creak and groan all the time. So a little embarrassed with myself for getting so freaked out, I went back downstairs, again locking the door behind me. I decided to get some sleep, so I popped in another movie, curled up on the couch, and just kind of passed out eventually. I was woken up a few hours later, about 2 a.m., to the dogs again in full-blown panic mode. This time, I could hear the creaking again, and then something else happened. I heard a dial tone. I heard a modem upstairs dial some numbers. I heard it try to connect. What the hell? Was I still asleep? No, I was definitely awake. I again grabbed the knife, went to the upstairs door, again unlocked. I opened the door and the noise again immediately cut off. I went upstairs to check again, nothing, and everything was still off and unplugged just as I had left it. I went back downstairs, locked everything up, and went to try and calm the dogs down. About 10 minutes later, I heard the modem start up again. It would dial, try to connect, stop, and then dial again and again and again. The creaking was back too, and this time it did sound like someone was walking around up there, even though I knew I was alone, and I had checked every conceivable place in that house for an intruder and, could find nothing. I put up with this for another half hour or so, and it didn't let up. The dogs would not calm down either. Eventually, I had enough. I just grabbed the dogs. I loaded them in my car, locked up, and got the hell out of there. I went back to my grandparents' place and I stayed there for the rest of the night with the dogs. Next morning, my grandparents were surprised to see me there and they asked me what happened. I told them about the previous night's events, feeling like I was crazy or something for what I had experienced. Strangely, though, they didn't seem surprised at all. They then told me that wasn't the first time something strange had happened there, and that my aunt and uncle had all kinds of stories about the place. For example, my little cousin frequently woke up screaming that a shadow man was looking at him in his bed. Or my uncle going upstairs to work on his computers one day and discovering the gas stove turned on, but unlit, leaking gas into the house. and all kinds of things being misplaced or doors left open or unlocked. So I don't know what to think, but there was definitely something paranormal going on in there because I have no other explanation. And I never really want to go back there again, to be honest. I'm not sure I ever will, but it was really quite scary. Definitely sounds like one of these old house, haunted house vortex for paranormal activity type of places where anything can happen. Perhaps something associated with the old woman who'd lived upstairs in the past or something. Hard to say, isn't it? How many people have lived in these houses and since they were built when they're really old, and what kind of people they were, their emotions and their negative emotions and stuff that got imprinted into the walls of the house. I don't know, it's kind of hard to say what you're going to experience in these places. It all really depends on the kind of people who live there, and what they were doing, what they were thinking. And, they play with the Ouija board or something and call on spirits. Perhaps back in the day when they were doing the, really into the whole spiritualist movement in these old houses, a lot of people were messing around with that stuff. So something could be lingering from that too.